We will start the presentation now, and thank you for joining us, and especially you as well, Chris, joining us all the way from the UK. We will begin. We know some people will be joining us a little bit later, and we've got more than one person around some devices. If no one objects, we will record this, and that will give us an opportunity to share it wider as well. So again, thank you, Chris, for joining us. Chris is going to talk about the Australian Joint Appeals Mechanism and the Emergency Action Alliance. COVID, as you all know, has certainly increased the humanitarian crisis globally and reversed decades or 30 years of poverty reduction, and at the same time, unfortunately, the funding gap is growing. We know that the Joint Appeals Mechanism is one way for generating new funds, and interested and excited to have you with us today, Chris, to talk about how this could work in New Zealand. Chris has led the design and setup of the Emergency Action Alliance, which now has a membership of about 18 Australian international NGOs, and it's well supported by the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade as well. So with over 25 years of experience in humanitarian work, we'd like to welcome you again, Chris, and hand over to you. We'll have a presentation for about 20 minutes, and we will welcome anyone to put any questions in the chat room, and we'll make sure we get to those questions at the end. So thanks again, and over to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Yes, so I'm not going to say too much about me. This isn't about me, but as Aaron says, when you say been in this sector for 25 years, I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing, really, because we seem to still have as many problems as when I started. But the Emergency Action Alliance is something that I've been very proud to be involved with for about 2.5 years now. And so I'll talk a bit about the way that the Emergency Action Alliance came into being in Australia, some of the details of the discussions and the thinking that we've been through, a little bit about the organisations, and a bit about the way that we need to, or we're thinking we're going to interact with the media, and also a little bit about how the money is allocated. So there will be a logo. There is a logo in existence. I think the logo is being preserved until the big launch, and so those are the colours that you will recognise in the future as the Emergency Action Alliance. So talking about why did the Australian NGO sector decide that it would contemplate a joint appeals mechanism, and it was called JAM before the Emergency Action Alliance. So JAM was quite a nice word, but we went through quite a lengthy a period of professional consultancy work to come up with a brand. An Emergency Action Alliance are the words that we think are going to appeal to the public most. So the context in which this was all started was been lots of reports in recent years about the fact, and Aaron alluded to it, that the humanitarian financing gap is increasing. Needs are increasing, the gap's increasing, and no matter how hard we run, we don't seem to be able to catch up. And so the context is partly based around that humanitarian need. The complexity and the scale of disasters, particularly with climate change, are increasing, but also I think political risk and large displacements and urbanisation are all changing the humanitarian context beyond recognition, really. And in order to respond to that, the sector is looking at new ways of responding. Things like localization, regionalization, cash programming, and working at scale. These are things that are changing the way that we work, and in some ways they are harder to be able to explain to donors, to the public. And so we needed a mechanism that would allow us to adapt to that. I think it's quite easy for the public to understand plane loads of tarpaulins running down runways after earthquakes, but actually that's not necessarily the way that we do things these days. And we're also realizing that DRR, reducing the risk before disaster strikes is a much more effective and efficient way of spending money. And yet the way that we're geared up to respond to humanitarian disasters at the moment is very much more targeted at putting the upsetting pictures on the television and then asking people to reach for their wallets. And it'd be nice if we could change the way that the public thinks so that they would actually help us to prepare communities who are vulnerable for the inevitable disasters ahead of those disaster events. So we know also that whilst the gap is increasing between the needs and the money that we've got to respond to them, we know that there's an increasing distrust, donor fatigue, and sometimes the media helps us and often it doesn't. And so there have been a lot of incidents or events and ways that things have been reported that have caused quite a lot of distrust. We know that we're getting less support. We know that donors are wanting to be very much more aware of how their money is spent. They want us to become more accountable for that. And so the declining support is something that we felt we needed a new mechanism to address. Multiple appeals. Now, this isn't just multiple events. This is multiple NGOs all competing with each other for the same appeal money. We know from research that's been done in other parts of the world that this confuses donors. And actually people are beginning to say, well, why are you lot competing with each other? There's enough need out there for us all, and yet you seem to be competing. And there was a sense that as many of the big international NGOs grew, they were growing by almost cannibalizing resources from other NGOs to acquire a larger percentage of the same market. What we wanted to do with the Emergency Action Alliance was to grow the pie. So we don't want to cannibalize existing sources. We wanted to be able to create new donor resources and sources. So that whole cannibalism, the inefficiencies, multiple advertising campaigns, multiple call centers, all these things, we needed to look at those to see whether or not we could get better efficiencies when we are raising money for emergencies. And one of the things that became very prominent in thinking, and I'll talk in a minute about DFAT's role in this, is that there was a perception that some of the agencies were responding to disasters in order to add to their own budget, to grow their own revenue, rather than necessarily because they were best placed to respond. Now, I'm not going to comment whether that's true or not. You'll probably know as well as I do whether it is. But often the agencies that raise the most money and get the most resources for a response are those that have got the best profile in the donor country. They're not necessarily always the same organizations that are best positioned to respond. And it was felt that in the ideal world, which we would like to live in, agencies should be helping each other to raise money for those agencies which are best positioned to respond, even if that means they're raising money for other agencies. That's what it means for the people who are affected by disasters. They don't realize or don't really care which color t-shirt you're wearing, as long as they get the help they need. And yet in our head offices, in our membership countries, we're competing with each other for profile. We're competing with each other for column inches. We're competing with each other for dollars. We shouldn't be. We should be competing or collaborating together to get the most resources to help people who have been affected by disasters. Communication is becoming increasingly hard, and in some cases we've simplified the message too much. Give me $10 and I'll send a goat somewhere. Yes, sometimes that's useful. Sometimes people don't need goats. That's just one example. But the communications around disaster response have become so simple that they've almost become meaningless in some ways. And if we're wanting the public to change the way that they respond, then and respond ahead of a disaster so that we can build the resilience of communities that will inevitably be hit by typhoons and these sorts of things, then we need to change the way that we respond, and we need to get better cut through. We need people to understand what it is that we're asking for. Public is expecting more accountability, yet they also want to have greater insight themselves and to some extent greater control over where their money is spent. And amidst all this, there's no real quality assurance reference point. So where you've got a dozen different agencies all going on television and saying, give to us because we're the best, how does the public know which of those 12 agencies to believe? And so we felt there was a need to be some kind of independent quality assurance mechanism there. So that's really the context that we were trying to respond to. So if I move on a little bit and now think about the history in Australia, between 1973 and 1993, there was a successful joint appeals mechanism that was hosted by ACFID, so the Australian equivalent of CID. That fell to pieces, and remember, these were the years of Band-Aid, Live Aid, massive Bangladesh cyclones and tidal surges and things like that. It was a very successful mechanism, but a couple of the big agencies decided that they could raise more money if they were to go alone outside of the mechanism, and they broke away from the mechanism. And again, that's sort of relating to that competition between agencies that we've come to see now. And when they broke away, basically, it meant that the purpose of having one point for the public to see as their giving point for a response went away, and very quickly the mechanism fell to pieces too. And since then, there have been 2 or 3 unsuccessful attempts to rekindle that collaborative fundraising mechanism in Australia. They were largely unsuccessful because some of the agencies wanted to continue to compete, I guess, felt that they could do better without being collaborative. And then in the second half of 2018, DFAT thought they saw some behaviours that they didn't like. Partly that was around the Rohingya response, and partly it was around one of the Pacific Island responses, where they felt that some of their partner agencies had tried to obtain funding, again, to grow their own budget, grow their own revenue, rather than necessarily because they were best placed to respond. And so I think it's fair to say that DFAT held some feet to fire and said to some of the agencies, we would like you to collaborate. It was harsh news. The boards and the CEOs and the executives took it very seriously. They realized that there was a veiled threat there. And so as a result of that, a working group was formed of just willing volunteers, really, from among the agencies. And ACFID helped with that working group, in that ACFID then took the thinking from the working group and offered it out to its entire membership, and said the next stage is we're actually going to get a group together that would like to initiate or to progress the thinking about the joint appeals mechanism. Every ACFID member is eligible to join that group if you wish. And that was very, very important. And I don't think I've still quite understood the importance of it, but I think I realized that there's more to it than appears at first sight. Because by doing that, by offering it open to the entire ACFID membership, it then meant that when the group was formed, those members that had opted to not join the group couldn't say that, we've been left out. They chose to be left out. For good reasons. There's no judgment there at all, but they chose to be left out, which then meant that ACFID could support the mechanism that developed from it. And so ACFID now will promote the Emergency Appeals Alliance as the mechanism in Australia for the public to give to emergency responses. So I think there are some of you that will probably take that thinking away and sort of understand it a bit better than I do. But that was certainly very key for the evolution of the joint appeals mechanism in Australia. So as a result of that initiative, 18 of Australia's well-known NGOs came together and formed a working group. It was at that point that they advertised for a project manager. I applied for the job, was interviewed among others, and was offered to become the project manager to set up the initiative. So the current plan is that in January this year, possibly at the end of December last year, the Emergency Action Alliance was incorporated as a legal entity in Australia, and then shortly afterwards, so one happened just before Christmas, the other happened just after Christmas, that it was registered by the ACNC as a charity. So that's where we are now, and the intention is that by the end of June, the mechanism will be ready to launch. So if I move on, those are the agencies that are in. Sadly, after sort of year and a half of discussions being involved in the meetings, the Australian Red Cross chose to leave the mechanism. So we now have 17 members, and the Australian Red Cross chose not to join for very good reason. But that was a bit of a disappointment, really, because the Australian Red Cross accounts for about half the volume of funds raised for emergency responses. And so, in effect, now it's good. Instead of there being 18 agencies all competing with each other, all competing for donors' attention, in effect, there'll now be two. So there'll be the Emergency Action Alliance and there'll be the Australian Red Cross. So as of December 2019, the members decided to join. 17 of them signed up. There was a little bit of to and fro, and we had another of the members who decided not to join up and then later decided to join again. But we've ended up with 18. And those, 17, and those 17 are assured of their place for the next 3 years, and no new members will be invited or allowed to join within the next 3 years. So there are 3 tiers of membership: small, medium, and large. Won't go into the details, but basically that reflects the amount of money that is raised or spent by each of the agencies, and they pay a membership subscription according to their size. And so far, between them, the 18 members have either paid or committed to $1.5 million. So in December 2019, they signed up that they would contribute a membership subscription for the next 3 years. Even if they choose to leave during that 3 years, they're still committed to the subscription. And that was very important too, because it gave us some funds to work with. Without that certainty, staff couldn't have been employed. We couldn't have undertaken website design. We couldn't have undertaken database design and all that sort of stuff. And then when COVID came along in March, I'll talk a little bit more about, well, I have talked a bit about DFAT, but DFAT is very keen for this to happen. But DFAT recognises that this has to be a sector initiative. It's not a government funding mechanism. We've got one of those already. We've got several of those already. This is a non-government funding mechanism for the public to donate. But DFAT is very keen for it to happen. They believe that the sector should be more coordinated. And also, they would like, when they launch funding from the government, to be able to say that the government would like to match public funding. It's probably a topic of another of these lunchtime sessions to think about match funding and the implications of that. So that's certainly something that they're quite keen to do. And then when COVID came along in March last year, clearly all of the member NGOs were busy sorting out their own programs, their own lots of changes, lots of resources having to be let go at that stage. And there was a concern that it would be difficult to justify continuing to commit to membership subscriptions and the work that goes alongside this when programs were being cut. And so we talked with DFAT, and DFAT wanted it to happen, so they contributed another $200,000 in April last year with the idea of getting us through COVID. Now, that meant that we could then continue the work, and it also gave the members confidence, and none of the agencies have said that they would have problems ring-fencing the commitment that they've made for subscriptions for the next 3 years. So that's quite amazing, actually, that despite all the chaos, despite the program closures, the 17 agencies considered that this was one of the solutions out of that problem, rather than an additional burden during that problem. So that again was very, very welcome. So thinking about we've talked about the financing gap, and there was a report which you're probably very familiar with in 2016, which was a high-level panel on humanitarian financing, a report commissioned by the Secretary General of the UN. And this was the where the grand bargain and several of these other initiatives, the Charter for Change and things like that, came from. But what that says really is that it's no good just having more money. We need to have more money, and we need to do the work better and more efficiently. And so we've tried within the design of the EAA to look at both sides. And I'll be honest with you, to start off with, there was a group of people who were saying, let's get the fundraising right to start off with, and then we'll add the impact later. And there's another group that said, hang on, you can't do that. You've got to do both at the same time. So we've managed to do it at the same time. We're looking at impact, not just the amount of dollars raised. For the first time ever, this will be the first mechanism in the world that allocates funds based on previous performance. So if an agency repeatedly performs well, it'll get a higher proportion of the funds collected from the Australian public than an agency that hasn't performed as well. And conversely, if an agency continually underperforms, eventually the amount of funding they will receive will reduce, and eventually they could actually drop out the bottom of the mechanism completely. So we believe that's an unprecedented level of accountability. And so that was something that's taken a lot of discussion, a lot of confidence building amongst CEOs. We've come up with a performance assessment framework. We've had a consultancy firm helping us with that through a series of workshops. And so at the end of every response, each of the agencies which responded will be opening themselves up for peer review. And that peer review will then allocate scores based on certain criteria. And those agencies that score well will get more money apportioned to them out of the funds raised from the public in the next appeal. We also recognize the value of unrestricted funds. Now, typically the total amount of money sent from Australia to these mega disasters, and we're talking initially about the mega disasters, is typically under 2% of the overall program budget. So as with many of your agencies, you will raise money in New Zealand and you'll send it off. It will be put into a big pool, and then there'll be a program management team who will decide how that money's spent. And so we needed to recognize that the member agencies in Australia may not have very much influence over how their money's spent, yet they still need to be accountable because they've asked for money from the public on the basis of the quality of the work that will be done with that money. We also recognize that unrestricted funds have significantly higher value than restricted funds, and that if we were to take away an agency's right to have unrestricted funds, then it might make the whole idea of the mechanism unattainable for them, unsustainable. Those unrestricted funds we know are absolutely critical. We wanted to value the diversity that each of the agencies bring. So it's not, we're measuring performance, but we're not measuring performance against each other. We're measuring performance against benchmarks that we have agreed at the beginning represent good. So we're talking about different colors of good. Different agencies may respond in different ways. They may have different approaches. They may respond at different times during that disaster risk management cycle. So we wanted to accept all of that. And at the end of the day, we wanted to be able to report back whether or not agencies had delivered value with the money raised from the public. And also, to be honest, I think the thing that clinched the membership from all 17 was that we realized that the way that we need to be able to improve the response to disasters is by preparing communities for disasters ahead of the disasters. And we needed to start shaping mindsets so that people are willing to give ahead of disasters. And it was interesting with the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Commission. My opening gambit with them was, we want you to be able to report good news. We want your headline story to be that there was a big cyclone in Vanuatu today and nobody was hurt and no buildings were damaged. And of course, that's not what we see on the news, but that would be the best news that we could give as a result of this sort of work. And so we realized that by coming together as a group of 17 or 18 agencies with consistent messaging, we would be in a much better position to be able to shape the way that the public thinks and the way the media thinks, so we can begin to change the behaviors of the public and the attitude towards giving. So they don't wait for the very upsetting pictures on the news. They want to give ahead of that so that we can do some resilience building work. ABC has been very, very helpful all along. We realized we needed at least one big national broadcaster on board for the whole thing to be doable. The ABC has been very helpful. They've drafted a MOU. Again, that's probably a conversation that would take another 15 or 20 minutes, so I won't go there. But they're also very keen to work with us to shape the way the public understands disaster risk reduction. And the Australian government, actually, which of course is a major stakeholder in the ABC, is also very keen for the ABC to do more to help the Australian public understand climate change because of the bushfires, because of just climate change is affecting Australia as much as it is anywhere else. And so this fitted in very, very well, that they were thinking that they need to change the way that they program to be able to help the public understand climate change. And it fitted very well with our agenda too. So quality of communications is critical. So there's two areas here. One is the way that the agencies communicate with the people who are affected by disasters, but also the way that the agencies give communications material for the EAA to be able to communicate back to its own donors. And so one of the 4 performance assessment indicators is quality of communications. And I think that's quite important too, because we realize it's not only about delivering high impact on the ground, it's us being able to tell that story so that we can build on that for the next disaster. So we've got some details here, but one of the interesting things perhaps is social media obviously is increasingly important in the way that we communicate with donors. With the Emergency Action Alliance, as soon as there's an appeal launched, all members' own branding will pretty much stop. They have to co-brand with the Emergency Action Alliance. And so in terms of things like social media, their own social media teams will need to be equally able to communicate about the EAA as they can about their own organizations. And, you know, again, that's just a little seed I've thrown in there. There could be hours and hours of discussion about the implications of that. But what we have decided is that will be a field media team, basically people who are ready to go on about 6-hour standby, so that the initial 2 weeks of a response will be covered by people who have been sent deliberately to do that. And they may be based in the country, but they will be on standby. And then after that time, we would have pre-agreed templates. So members would be able to report back to provide information for the EAA's website and other communications according to templates that have been agreed well in advance. So that's a little bit about media. There's a lot more about that I could talk about. Allocation formula. There are about 13 other joint appeal mechanisms worldwide. Some of them are very old, some of them are more than 70 years old, some of them are very new. So there are some that just have started in the last year or two. Most of them, not all, but most of them have some kind of allocation formula. The DEC in the UK is probably the best known, or certainly best known in Anglophone circles. And they have something called an indicator of capacity. And the indicator of capacity is derived from a very long and very complicated questionnaire that members answer each year. And it talks about the amount of money that they raise and the amount of money that they spend in various parts of the world for emergency responses. So we've gone along the idea of some kind of allocation formula, but then for the first time ever, the allocation will be influenced by performance as well. So the things that will contribute to what we're calling an allocation baseline indicator is the public profile of the market position. We've got World Vision, which is 10 or maybe 15 or even more times bigger than some of the smaller members in the EAA. It would be a little distorted if the smaller members were to receive as much as World Vision, because they won't have the same capacity to spend the money wisely. So that public profile and position is one of the factors. And there's part of the Australian government's membership criteria is one of those long and complicated questionnaires that already exists. It's already audited each year by DFAT. And we've recognized that that actually is a good enough proxy for what we want initially, without having to put more burden on agencies to produce yet more data for this. So we'll be using that to start off with. The humanitarian capacity is, of course, highly important in terms of an agency's capacity to spend money that's raised. And so we've got a way there of looking at how much money they spend. It's a poor proxy for capacity, but that's the best we could get, but also on disaster risk reduction. And then, as I say, those numbers will be modified by their performance over previous appeals. So at the beginning of a response, members decide whether they opt in or not. When they do opt in, they have to say broadly what they're going to do and when they're going to do it and what resources they have available. Once we know who's opted in, then we can do some calculations and work out a proportion of the overall money raised that will go to each of the agencies. So I'm nearly there now. We're nearly at our time for questions. I've talked about the performance assessment by peer review. The 4 criteria: impact, measured against benchmark. So we're looking at the different colors of good here. Different agencies working in different ways through partners, direct implementation at different parts of that disaster risk management lifecycle. Value for money. And here we're not only looking at the value for money of the program itself, but whether or not agencies use the unrestricted funding that was raised from the public effectively. So a very crude and nasty example here. Agency A gets $100,000, buys some tarpaulins and sends it to Haiti or Vanuatu or wherever. Agency B uses that money uses $100,000 to kickstart several projects and to secure $2 million worth of donor funding. Now, both have had $100,000. They've both chosen to use it in their own way, but clearly one has managed to leverage more value from it than the other has, particularly in the early stages of these big responses where some of those NFI items, etc., are quite often overfunded, and our capacity to distribute them is the limiting factor rather than the amount of funds to buy them. So areas there about value for money. Consistency with the capacity identified, and this is responding to that best place to respond. So agencies which overstate their capacity and then fail to deliver will be penalized. So, and this also causes agencies to ask whether or not, in fact, they are best placed to respond, or are other agencies better placed to respond. And even though they're not best placed to respond and won't be receiving money, they can still contribute towards the appeal, raise money, which can then be spent by an organization that is actually in a better location, better place, then quality of communications. So that was the allocation formula. And again, I can go into that in much more detail another time. So the current situation, an executive director, Karen Morris, was appointed at the end of 2020. So her feet are well and truly under the table now. I'm getting fewer and fewer emails and having fewer and fewer Zoom calls with her. But she's got a long background in fundraising, and so she's the executive director. So it is a company limited by guarantee. There's a board, there's charity approved. First general meeting was in March. The agencies were formally accepted as members of that entity. The boards were appointed, and now the secretariat functions, operation manuals and stuff like that are being developed. So that was really where I was going to stop. I know that I was asked at one point whether or not I had any ideas as to how this might relate in New Zealand. So I'll put up just one slide here, which I guess is for thinking about. We know that DFAT played a key part in getting agencies to talk about this and take it seriously. But DFAT has recognized, and we've told them very explicitly, thank you for that help. It's very important that we're on side, but this is a non-governmental mechanism which complements the governmental mechanism. They're very happy with that. They want it to happen and they want us to do it, and they've provided some money to help us do it. But that partnership was very key. Getting a group of interested agencies together to have the ideas and think how it would work, that was very important. And then in Australia, ACFID opening it up to the membership so that those agencies that chose to be part of it could be part of it, and yet the sector could accept that the agencies that form the ultimate body are representing the sector. Everybody's had an opportunity to join, and for various reasons, some have and some haven't. And so we could think of it in similar lines in New Zealand. The other thing that I would say is that it's been great for me. I've been earning money as a consultant, leading all this thinking for 2.5 years. But a hell of a lot of thinking has been done by colleagues, some of them you'll know from your own organisations. And I have asked the question, if New Zealand were to want to do this, how much of the Emergency Action Alliance thinking and documentation, all the rest would be accessible to New Zealand? And the answer is just about everything. So the Australian NGOs who have formed the Emergency Action Alliance would be very keen to provide whatever resources they could into New Zealand, so that we can shorten the time and shorten the cost of establishing a mechanism here. And at the moment, the Australian mechanism is only going to be activated for mega disasters. Yet we know really that within Australia and New Zealand's backyard, the Pacific Islands are very vulnerable to disaster. The responses are quite different between the big Pakistan floods and Typhoon Haiyan and things like that, and Pacific Island responses. But there could be an argument that if Australia is thinking and setting up the mechanism for the big mega disasters, perhaps New Zealand might think about some of the smaller Pacific Island disasters. I'm going to stop there. I've been far more than 20 minutes, but I'll stop and hand over now to Aaron to chair the discussion or questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. And it's really encouraging to sort of note that 12 of the Emergency Action Alliance members that you've mentioned are present here, and members of CID as well. I'm particularly interested to know, or keen to find out more about DFAT's role in getting the Australian model off the ground, and what, sort of from your view, what was in it for DFAT?
I think there were several things in it for DFAT. I mean, I believe that DFAT is genuinely concerned about the quality of response that Australia is able to offer. As in New Zealand, DFAT recognises that its NGO partners are the majority of its response capacity, and anything that can be done to improve the resourcing and the quality of their NGO partners, they're supportive of. I think that's one side of it. I mean, I think you could also be a little cynical perhaps and say, in a climate where government funding is under scrutiny, is being cut, and yet Australia still wants to be able to show the world that it's contributing very generously to humanitarian responses. If there's another mechanism for raising funds, and Australia can say, this is how much we have contributed overall, which is partly government funding and partly is public funding, then, you know, it adds to the picture of the generous humanitarian response from Australia. I think those are the partly it, but also I think they recognise the public's frustration, the public wanting agencies to be more accountable, wanting less confusion, wanting less competition, because ultimately it discredits DFAT if their partners, their implementing partners, are being challenged or not trusted by the, you know, the voters, I guess. So I think there was lots of it, but DFAT was very, very key, but they're also very understanding that they want this to happen, but they don't want to do it. It's got to be done by the agencies themselves.
Thanks, Chris. And we would like to open it up to questions, so that if anyone does have a question to ask Chris, please raise your hand, the icon, or put the message in the chat room, please.
I mean, I can answer Campbell's question there a little bit about whether it's replicable in New Zealand. A smaller scale, I think that as I alluded to at the end, I think there's this big gap at the way that it's evolved in Australia at the moment, in that, you know, just simply that not trying to bite off everything in one bite is meaning that we're looking at mega disasters, whereas we know that the Pacific Island is also important. I do think there's some complementarity there, and that's an area I'd encourage you to look at.
Ben, you've put your hand up, so would welcome your question.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Hi, Chris. It's Ben here from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Appreciate the PowerPoint and the explanations. It was really interesting to hear. I guess one question I have is around kind of the ability to kind of decide on priorities around what is the mega disasters in which you're engaging in, considering looking globally right now, I would say there are a few kind of mega disasters out there, but also that balance between disaster risk reduction and response. So you say that, you know, there will be funding made available through this for both immediate response and DRR. Is that within the framing of these mega disasters? Or how does that kind of play out? And would there be a ratio on funding around DRR versus response?
I think you've asked lots of questions there. In terms of deciding what a mega disaster is, we've looked at various categories. I mean, the UN, UNOCHA have got various categories, the Red Cross have got categories, governments have got categories, we've all got categories. And at the end of the day, we said, well, basically, we all know what a mega disaster is when it happens, and it would be up to the board to decide whether or not a particular disaster qualified for various reasons. And that would be around things like, do we have sufficient humanitarian access? Is it politically possible for us to work there without appearing to be biased one way or the other? And have we got agencies on the ground who can respond? And will there be benefit to raising money together? If there's only one or possibly two agencies, then it may not be worth doing that. So I think that's there. In terms of the DRR, we're not going to be prescriptive about that. And at the moment, I think to start off with, most if I go back to that model, which is the one of the Red Cross models, they're about the stages of the disaster risk management cycle on the top right there. We're saying that money can be spent, is eligible to spend within what is that termed that response phase. Now, we aren't putting any timing on that. It may be 6 months, it may be 2 years. So what I think we've said is that agencies would need to commit how they're going to spend the money within 12 months and spend it within 2 years. So that's the guideline at the moment. Now, bear in mind, as I said before, that typically the Australian government and NGO sources together contribute in the region of only 2% to these mega disasters. And so it's a very small amount of money. The money is going to be almost invariably co-funding rather than funding projects. So we're not asking agencies to respond on projects, and the assessment of their performance will be on the program that the funding has contributed to. So we're not going to be looking for deliverables. We're not going to be looking for log frames to say, did you deliver what you were going to deliver? We're looking at the quality of the program, and then it's up to each of the agencies to justify how this very small amount of money added to the success of the program. And we felt that was much more appropriate for a small amount of money rather than trying to allocate a small amount of money to a little project and find that it's one of 15 wash projects or something. It doesn't really make that difference. Now, I know that that's different to the way that institutional donors have to do it for various reasons, but bearing in mind, big mega disaster budgets are made up of lots and lots of tiny little bits of money. When I was managing Save the Children's response after Cyclone Nargis, I remember I had 128 grants to manage. So, 2% might sound little, but you've got lots of 2%. So, yeah, that's a bit of a messy answer. I'll be happy to talk a bit further about that, Ben, offline, but it's not prescriptive in that way. So it's a very different approach to how we allocate funds and how we account for how funds have been spent.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Chris. Everyone out there, we know that there's a number of people around different devices. If anyone does have a question, please again raise your hand or put it in the chat. Chris, I have another question here. I'm quite interested in the whole sort of negotiation process between organizations when they're considering being part of this alliance. And I sort of imagine that quite obviously there'd be a tension between, the disadvantage or perceived cost for big agencies versus the advantages or additional benefit for small agencies or organizations. How did you progress or address some of the issues that would have come up in that conversation?
I mean, you're right. That was a huge tension in some ways. I think it probably took the best part of a year for all of us to get competition and competing for market share out of our heads. I mean, that's the way that a lot of our fundraising teams are rewarded: number of names on databases and how much money they raise. We said, look, this is about collaboration. And again, we were calling it a JAM at the time, Joint Appeals Mechanism. And I found a little cartoon character of a refugee girl sitting around a little wood fire, stirring her pot. And I called her Jamila. And for several months, when we had these meetings, I used to flash up a picture of Jamila. And we always said, Jamila is chairing this discussion. And at the end of the day, she has a casting vote. Is what we're saying going to be what Jamila values or not? And Jamila doesn't care what color t-shirt we're wearing or what logo we've got. All Jamila cares is that she's got food for the next day. And so, I mean, it was quite cheesy in that respect, but it helped because it did help us realize that it didn't matter about our own organizations. What we were trying to do was get the best benefit for the people who are affected by disasters. So and then the other real game changer, I think, was when we realized that it wasn't just about doing things the same way. We needed to change the way that the public and the media thinks about fundraising. And we said, well, you know, if we continue to go out and there's 18 different organizations all giving different messages, we're not going to change the way that people think. We're just going to confuse them. And so once we began to focus that it won't happen now, it won't happen this year, but it's certainly something that's on the roadmap, if you like, as to how can we use this mechanism to talk to the public in a different way. Then agencies began to realize that being part of this was far more valuable than just their market share in terms of dollars. And so those were two of the key things. I think in terms of some of the smaller agencies, they were worried, and still are worried, to be honest, that some of the bigger agencies may kick them out. And there were some very, very explicit conversations, some of them in public forums, some of them not, where some agencies felt that we should be reducing the number of agencies in the JAM, and were deliberately looking at ways to decide which agencies should come in and which should be out. And obviously the smaller agencies felt more vulnerable there. But we began to talk about it. Now, typically, the budgets that spent on advertising for a big disaster range from about $5,000 to $75,000 amongst the range of the members for the same event, same disaster. And so what we were saying was, well, if you all that up, that's a lot of money. If we could do one advertising campaign and it costs ineffectively, it costs the big agencies less, and it costs the small agencies benefit. Instead of spending $5,000, they're now part of a $25,000 advertising campaign. Actually, all of us are going to benefit from that. It's going to be a stronger campaign anyway. We know that the agencies that have got the biggest brand profile so far are going to continue to get more money. And the donors don't only have to give through the JAM. If the donor said, actually, I've seen the EAA's advertising campaign and I want to give to Save the Children or Oxfam or World Vision because they're my favorite charity, they can still do that. So overall, we kind of created the paradigm and convinced ourselves that it was a win-win-win for everybody by going together. That's not to say that the discussions weren't long and painful and sometimes very torturous and went round in circles, but I think that those were the things in my mind that stuck out as to why agencies decided to join in the end.
Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess I have one, not sure if it's a statement or a question, but you said there was about 18 members in Australia. What's a target number for the size of the New Zealand sector, do you think, to get this off the ground?
Well, I think it depends how you think about it, isn't it? Because the key thing here was to reduce confusion. So we know that faith-based agencies have their own congregations, they have their own constituents, and we want them to continue to communicate with those. We're not cannibalizing anything, we're trying to add new people in. And so, but what we realized was that the more different agencies that are out there doing big public advertising, the more confusing it is for the public. And so at the end of the day, it wasn't how many agencies are in the mechanism, it's how many agents or how many appeals are the public going to see when the mechanism exists. And so what we anticipate at the moment is there's probably going to be two. There'll be the EAA and there'll be the Australian Red Cross. I think if we could find a way to get the Australian Red Cross back in the fold, then I think, all stops will be pulled out. But that's the way that we were looking at it. So what's the key number here? I think you need to create a critical mass so that this becomes the least confusing message for the New Zealand public. It needs to be enough that it's credible. Ideally, it needs to be enough that the government and CID and the media are able to say, this is the public funding mechanism for this response. That was key, particularly with the media. If we felt that if the ABC or the SBS weren't able to support us, then we may as well not do it, because we needed one very high profile channel that the public then associated with big disasters. And we know in the DEC in the UK, they've done lots and lots of research, and they're very, very generous and giving us all this research and a lot of information. They conducted some research, and they know that a large number of their donors say, the DEC is advertising, therefore it is a big emergency and it's big enough for me to give to it. And that's the only time they'll ever give to charities. And so you've got to have it big enough that the public recognizes that because it's been launched, it's big enough to be important. And so for that, the DEC has launched, I think, on average 1.5 times in the last 9 years, 1.5 times per year in each of the last 9 years on average. And so for the EAA is considering a similar, 1 to 2 times a year maximum, launching for big disasters. Now, that's not to say if another big one doesn't come out, you won't get 3, but it's something that needs to be used sparingly, because it has its impact, because it is only used for the really big disasters.
Thank you, Chris. And I think unless there's any further questions, we will conclude it there. I find this really exciting, and we sort of look forward to it at CID to sort of discuss this further with our membership, Chris, and then eventually discuss it wider. But thanks again, Chris, for joining us. I know it's a
pleasure.
Horrendous time of the morning for you over there, and thank you for everyone else for joining us. We will make sure the slides and the recording is available for everyone, and